Focke-Wulf's 190As. Other possessed later variants, the long-nosed FW-190D or the ultra-fast 109K. Still others whistled into battle with the new Me-262 jet fighter, Germany's last hope to turn the tide of the air war in its favor. Over northern Germany, the battle was joined. The jets of JG-7 and KG-54 waded into the bombers, making swift runs through their formation, cannons blazing.
Somebody would announce that there's a jet coming through, and we'd finally get on them, and I couldn't pick them up till they were down lower from the bottom turret, but they would come screaming down through the formation, and I don't know that I could even track them with the turret because they were going so fast. I never shot at one. There were very few ever came close to us.
We saw them going through in a joining group formation, and they came through faster than anything we'd ever seen. What was that?
We've seen Me-262s, but they were fast. They just flew right through the formations, and they were very fast.
As the Me-262 disengaged, the older 190s and 109s tried to reach the bombers. They were bounced by hundreds of American fighters. Soon, twisting, curling dogfights erupted all over the sky, punctuated by explosions as fuel tanks were hit and demarcated by long trails of smoke as plane after plane plummeted to the soggy ground below. Then the untried youths of Sonderkommando Elbe straggled into the fray. Their inexperienced ranks were savaged by pouncing Mustangs and Thunderbolts. Most never even reached the bombers. Unable to dogfight, they simply didn't know how. They were shot down wholesale. But a few of the Raumjägers reached the bombers. They would do their duty. Down they plunged on the American flying fortresses and liberators, their targets swelling in the wind screens. Defensive fire from the bomber boxes scored many hits, sending several of the German pilots spiraling toward Earth, trapped in their burning cockpits. But the gunners failed to stop the remaining men, who smashed their 109s and 190s into the wings and fuselages of their American targets. 8 times these macabre collisions occurred. 8 times the Liberator or Fortress would be torn in half or would explode into a tremendous fireball. 2 more times bombers were hit but continued to fly, while the Raumjäger went down with his crippled interceptor. By day's end, as the Luftwaffe's few survivors dribbled back to their bases, it was clear that the Germans had at last tasted final defeat. Over 133 planes were lost, along with 75 pilots. Half of Sonderkommando Elbe had been annihilated. 7 of the precious Me-262s were gone. Those who reached home were frequently wounded or burned. Most of the survivors would never fly again. 17 American bombers and 5 fighters were shot down or rammed out of the sky. Far from being the decisive shock that would end the bombing campaign, Sonderkommando Elbe's only mission had been but a spasm in the Luftwaffe's death agony. Only 2 years before this last flight of the Luftwaffe, Germany controlled the skies over almost all of Europe. From the Channel coast to the steppes of Russia, the German fighter pilot ruled supreme. "24 months later, the Reich squadrons lay in crumbled heaps across the length and breadth of the continent, its pilots dead or wounded. This is the story of how this once proud elite corps was so utterly defeated. This is the story of the defenders of the Reich. In 1939, no air force in the world was larger or more modern than Germany's Luftwaffe. Built almost from scratch over the previous 6 years, Germany's Air Force had the best planes, the best equipment, and its pilots were considered the elite of Hitler's armed forces.
The pilots of the Luftwaffe are some of the best of the German armed forces going into World War II. And that's for a variety of reasons. They have a very stringent testing program, they have stringent training standards, and the Luftwaffe has become the premier arm of the German armed forces. And in this way, they have become lionized as kind of the elite of the German armed forces.
Their mission was simple: bring the war to the enemy through terror, tactical support, and army cooperation. The core of the new Air Force consisted of the dive bomber groups, the dreaded Stukas, and the level bombers, such as the Heinkel 111 and the Dornier 17. When Germany attacked Poland that September, the Stukas were used to assist the Panzer forces on the ground. Through their pinpoint accuracy, the Stuka could sow destruction upon troop concentrations, bunkers, pillboxes, forts, and other tactical targets. While the dive bombers worked closely with the Wehrmacht, the Heinkels and Dorniers would rain bombs down on the rear areas, blowing up bridges, railheads, road intersections, and airfields. When it was deemed necessary, they could be turned against civilian targets and used as terror bombers to bring a population to its knees.
Terror bombing is a concept that is highly touted in the period between World War I and World War II. And the Luftwaffe will take hold of this concept, basically the bombing of undefended or lightly defended civilian populations, as a way to bring them to their knees and break the will of the opponent to continue to fight.
Germany had learned such tactics well from the Spanish Civil War and used terror bombings against Warsaw in the fall of 1939, then again against Rotterdam, Holland in the spring of 1940. Later, London would suffer a similar fate. It was in the Polish campaign and the subsequent invasion of the Low Countries and France in 1940 that the Luftwaffe first earned its reputation of invincibility. German bombers and dive bombers caused panic wherever they appeared, while the fighters wiped out whatever aerial resistance they encountered and soon took control of the air over the battlefield. In only a matter of days in each of these early campaigns, the Luftwaffe's fighter pilots quickly established air supremacy, allowing the Stukas and Heinkels to wreak havoc without fear of interception. By the spring of 1940, the Luftwaffe had conquered all. And yet there were troubling signs within the German Air Force even at this early stage in the war. Conceived and developed with such haste in the 1930s, the Luftwaffe was bound to have institutional problems. Most serious of these was a lack of adequate staff work or strategic planning.